Since its conquest by the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC, and in fact even earlier since its conquest by the Greeks in the 4th century BC, the lands of the Near East have been deeply interconnected with the lands of the early Western world. For a time, the Greek world was defined by the massive harbor created by the various Hellenic states of Macedonia, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, but a great rivalry and lack of cooperation with one another prevented unity between them and kept from them the full wealth and power that could have been harnessed from so strategically valuable a territory. In the face of encroaching enemies on all sides, the Greeks and their territories were subsumed by the better united Roman Empire, and it was under Rome that the East Mediterranean grew to become perhaps the wealthiest center of commerce of its time, holding a footing on 3 continents, secure from any major naval threats, and having a diverse assortment of resources to draw upon. The Roman East came to surpass the Roman West as far as seeing the capital of the empire move to the new eastern city of Constantinople. Between Constantinople, Antioch, and Alexandria emerged a golden sphere of culture, wealth, and power. It would ultimately be from these eastern lands, the Levant in particular, that Christianity would arise and spread across the empire to become the foremost faith of the Western world. But these lands which had long given unto the West so much would not remain in their hands forever. Western Rome would collapse. Eastern Rome would find itself locked in seemingly endless conflict with the empires of Persia, conflict which left both empires so fatigued that neither was able to prevent the rapid and violent rise of the Islamic Caliphate from Arabia, which proceeded to assimilate great swaths of both Rome and Persia in the span of mere decades. What remained of Eastern Rome was merely a rump state consisting primarily of Greece and Anatolia, and so it would remain for centuries, but much would change in that time. Powerful states emerged in Europe carrying forward fragments of the torch of Roman civilization. The East Roman Byzantines would rebound and retake some lost lands. New migrating powers arrived in the East, shaking up the Islamic balance of power, which had itself reached a point of disunion and instability, and despite a religious schism within the Church, a final series of concerted efforts were made by the Christian West to regain their historic territories in the East, an effort to regain their Holy Land, an effort that would ultimately come to be known as the Crusades. Despite the slight rebound of the Byzantine Empire, they still stood threatened by the Islamic powers, most especially the Seljuk Turks, who in 1071 dealt a devastating blow to the Byzantines during the Battle of Manzikert, and proceeded to occupy increasingly large portions of Anatolia as the years progressed. The Byzantine Emperor thus sought assistance from the West, where Pope Urban II, sensing the decline of the Eastern Church and seeking to heal the schism in the West's favor, proceeded to rally together an army of volunteers numbering in the tens of thousands. From the get-go, while the Crusader armies were immensely driven by religious zeal, they generally lacked significant organization and higher leadership. Certainly there were leaders, but often they found themselves in rivalry with one another, none fully wishing to concede authority to the rest. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios was a warrior who reveled in military action, and it was his expectation that the support given to him by the West would be a smaller number of disciplined mercenaries to bolster his own ranks, rather than the large disorganized barbarian armies he received. Ultimately, he himself didn't play a major participating role in the crusade, having reversed his army before reaching Antioch because of a deception by one of the Crusader kings. This king Bohemond, son of the Norman conqueror of southern Italy, would, like his father, challenge the Byzantines militarily from his newly established principality in Antioch, turning what was meant to be a recaptured land for the empire into an adversary for years, before it was ultimately vassalized by Byzantium. Returning to the matter of leadership, Pope Urban II was simply too geographically removed from the conflict, not to mention too inexperienced to serve in a direct leadership role. But he had sent a papal legate to act on his behalf, who became well known for his military prowess, a man by the name of Adhemar, who was immensely respected by the Crusaders, to the point that he was held up as their symbolic leader even after his death. Now that is the trouble. Adhemar had died after contracting a disease shortly after the siege of Antioch, and tragically he was in the process of settling leadership disputes and potentially forging a clear command hierarchy just prior to his demise, and of course, this was never completed. Despite these difficulties of organization and a number of other factors which stalled the crusade, Jerusalem was ultimately reached, and it too was captured with Crusader King Godfrey of Bouillon assuming control of the new kingdom, before being succeeded by his brother Baldwin, who had previously established the Crusader kingdom of Edessa, and now as King of Jerusalem, came to dominate the remaining Crusader kingdoms of Tripoli and Antioch. Baldwin proved an extremely capable leader, and though the crusade itself lacked organized leadership, the states produced by it were brought into fine working harmony through his successful guidance. He repelled invasions, consolidated his authority and the governments of the Crusader states, and began a settlement process of Jerusalem with European Christians. Toward the end of his reign, Baldwin launched an invasion of Egypt in retaliation for the persistent attacks on Jerusalem, and nearly conquered Cairo with the intention of fully subduing this neighboring threat and bringing it under Christian rule. But before he could, his health would take a turn for the worse, and an old wound of his would leave him incapable of proceeding any further. The invasion was cancelled and he would be succeeded by his cousin who would be named Baldwin II, and although he would prove an acceptable ruler, he was unable to replicate the success of Baldwin I, and in time Egypt would rebound, and with Damascus among others in the east, the Crusader states would be threatened on both sides and unable to retaliate without further assistance from Europe. Assistance was in fact lent through the issuing of several more crusades, and there were many times in which the Crusaders attempted to topple either Egypt or Damascus, which would have strengthened their position against the other power. But each time these efforts fell through either by a little or a lot, and as the years wore on, the position of the Crusader states became more compromised and the Crusades themselves became less effective, until ultimately Jerusalem was lost and the Crusader states were no more. But what if all that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the Crusades succeeded? But before going any further, we've got a special offer for all you financially minded fellas out there from today's sponsor, Masterworks. Some of you might already be involved in stock trading on apps like Robinhood and the like, but Masterworks is offering a new and unique way to invest. Specifically, Masterworks is an expert-run platform that allows you to invest in artwork, something which, since around the year 2000, has been appreciating at a higher rate than even the S&P 500, yielding greater increases on initial investment for the super wealthy who've already been investing in this asset class for years, but now you can too. Getting started is quick and easy, as simple as making an account and browsing a wide variety of art and investing in what you feel has the most value and potential. The stock market can be very rough and unpredictable, but art has increasingly remained a continually stable asset to invest in. Even if it doesn't become your prime avenue of investment, it couldn't hurt to add a few art assets to your portfolio and see where they go. Now, art investment typically does come with a wait list, but if you click on the link in the description of this video, you'll get to skip the line and get right into investing. So go on and give it a try. Now, back to the video. The purpose of virtually all the numerical crusades was simple: secure the Holy Land. The success of the First Crusade in regaining the West's lost foothold on the Levantine coast was easily the most crucial part of the crusading effort, and everything following the stabilization of the Crusader states should have been relatively simple. But early stumbles on the part of the Christian powers allowed the Islamic powers to better prepare themselves, and a combination of chance, geography, diplomacy, and strategy all went against the Crusader states, costing them both land and morale. And once that was lost, without a great deal of outside involvement, decline was inevitable from that point on. The success of the Crusades essentially becomes more and more difficult as time goes on, and thus the best possible way to ensure their perpetual success in this scenario is to eliminate one or multiple threats to the Crusader states as early as possible. That opportunity comes in the form of Baldwin I's campaign against Egypt. The Egyptians, or rather the Fatimid Caliphate at the time, were heavily destabilized, caught off guard, and without support from the Turkic Islamic powers to the east. Baldwin's success in pushing as far as the Nile Delta put him in an ideal position to launch an attack against the Fatimid capital of Cairo and bring Egypt under Crusader control. The conquest of Egypt would be immensely more significant for the Crusader states than if we were to suppose an effort against Damascus or any other eastern power were to succeed. As I've said in regard to the Byzantine Empire in a previous video, Egypt is an extremely valuable hub of agricultural resources necessary to build a large population, the kind of population needed to build a capable standing domestic army. The loss of Egypt was a major contributing factor in Byzantium's shift from the use of a standing army to one composed primarily of foreign mercenaries, and as we've seen even in the case of the Crusades, entrusting your security to foreigners whose chief interest is monetary or land compensation is a formula for betrayal and exploitation. Despite the efforts of Baldwin and his successors, the Christian population within the Crusader states remained relatively low throughout their entire history, and it did not help that most Crusaders wound up returning home once the crusade was done. If the Crusader states were to succeed, they need to be able to build a large population capable of protecting and developing their lands, and only once these states build a reputation for being stable, secure, and developed will they attract new settlers from Europe in significant number. Further, what lies beyond Egypt is generally well understood, and the threats that could emerge from Northwest Africa are limited, while the Christian states of Europe are at the very least familiar and sympathetic to the security of the Holy Land. If Damascus were to be conquered, sure, this particular threat might be neutralized for the time being, but the East has a habit of always spawning new and terrible threats that drive Western advances back. Whether it be the Greeks, the Romans, or the Crusaders, the lands beyond the Tigris and Euphrates are not held easily, and any investment beyond their borders will almost certainly demand centuries of war and exhaustion for a prize that is never guaranteed. With Egypt secured under Baldwin's Kingdom of Jerusalem, threats would still exist to the west, but would pose significantly less of a danger to the Crusader states than did Egypt, as not only would coordination with the Eastern Islamic powers be far more difficult if not impossible, but the lands of Cyrenaica would be nowhere near as resource-rich and as populated. Now this still means that incursions into Crusader land would need to be repelled on both sides for a time, But with the agricultural lands of Egypt under their control, all the Crusader states would need to do is endure. With the coasts of the East Mediterranean brought entirely under Christian control, we could expect the eventual emergence of a capable navy for the Kingdom of Jerusalem in particular. As Jerusalem's population began to grow naturally, so too would a larger army be established, allowing it to exert further control over the other Crusader states, gradually consolidating them into a single entity and preventing the interstate rivalry and infighting that would have contributed to their collapse. In the meantime, relations between the states and the Byzantines would see improvement under Alexios' successor, John II, the schism being partially bridged by the common enemies on their doorstep, though not being entirely mended. The Outremer, or rather just Greater Jerusalem, with a Crusader population of largely Frankish and Norman stock, while also sharing common interests with the Byzantines because of its proximity, would eventually grow into a mediating power between the Byzantines and Norman Italy, who had come to develop an animosity for one another in years prior. It was in the best interest of the Outremer to prevent conflict between these two, as each stood as their nearest most capable ally in the east and west respectively. And while their animosity threatened to compromise the security of the Crusader state, their cooperation would have enabled further gains for the Christian powers as a whole. In our timeline, the Italian Normans would manage to conquer Tunisia and the Tripolitanian coast, not to be confused with the Tripoli of the east. However, this conquest was short-lived and limited, as the region was ultimately abandoned to the Almohad Caliphate in order to focus on the threat Byzantium posed to southern Italy instead. But this time, things are different. Seeking to play its allies to its own interests, Jerusalem mediates a peace between the Byzantines and Normans, pledging its support in campaigns that would allow Byzantium to retake the whole of Anatolia and allow Sicily to consolidate its position in North Africa. From this, the Outremer would gain control of Cyrenaica, Cyprus, and northern Syria, while putting a buffer state between itself and the Almohads of the Maghreb. Armenian Cilicia, who had long stood as an ally of the Crusader states but stood in the way of Byzantium's goal of reuniting Anatolia, might see incorporation into the Crusader states' borders to prevent a conquest and subjugation by Byzantium. But regardless of whether or not that's the case, this state could be expected to fall well within Jerusalem's sphere of influence. The success of this threefold alliance would be crucial to ensuring Byzantium and Jerusalem establish fortified eastern frontiers by the time the Mongols arrive a century later. The Turks still remain as a major threat to both states, and it's unlikely the Byzantines and Crusaders would be able to contend with one another as well as the Turks and still endure the Mongol conquests. Continued cooperation would be the difference between them emerging largely unscathed and being left crippled and vulnerable to an Islamic resurgence. Additional minor crusades might be called in support of the Holy Land during their wars with the Muslims, but they would almost certainly be far smaller in scale than in our timeline, as the crusades which followed the first were really only called in response to major losses by the Crusader states, first the fall of Edessa and then the loss of Jerusalem. With the Holy Land in a much stronger position, it's safe to assume that any further assistance from the Western European powers would be minor, though consequentially this means no disastrous Fourth Crusade to cripple the Byzantines, leaving them in a better state than in our world and thus able to serve as a better ally to Jerusalem. Military adversaries would not be the only challenge Byzantium and the Crusaders need face, however, as years of Mongol raids would be followed shortly thereafter by the outbreak of the bubonic plague. Given Jerusalem's position as a major trade hub dominated by coastal urban centers, we could expect the plague to impact the Holy Land particularly hard, causing massive population decline and general instability. It is at this point that a fragmentation of Greater Jerusalem is possible if a high enough Christian population hasn't yet been established, and if the Christian population is most significantly impacted by the plague, which would be the case if they remained concentrated in large cities and never expanded out to the rest of the state. Even if Egypt were to break away as a result of this instability, Jerusalem with its ally of Sicily in the west would be able to recapture this vital land so long as it retained a large enough population to maintain its army. If that's not the case, and the plague has utterly crippled Jerusalem's ability to enforce its authority over its neighboring realms, its gradual disintegration is likely, especially with the resurgence of the Turks following the fall of the Mongols. Their best hope of survival from that point on would be to see annexation to the much stronger Byzantine Empire of this timeline. Just for the sake of this scenario, we'll assume it doesn't come to that, and the Holy Land remains united after a period of stabilization. By the 1400s, the Ottoman Empire as we knew it in our world would not exist. In its place would remain the Empire of Byzantium, never destabilized by the sack of Constantinople and having benefited from the presence of a Christian ally in the Near East, it would continue to encompass the lands of the southern Balkans and of Anatolia. Outside of Asia, major Islamic powers have been contained to the far northwest and Horn of Africa, and with Christian Iberia having retaken the whole of the peninsula well ahead of schedule thanks to the improved position of the Christian powers as a whole and the weakening of the Islamic powers in North Africa, serious considerations would be made for a retaliatory invasion and Christianization of Morocco, though whether or not it will be successful is yet to be seen. Jerusalem and the Holy Land would remain firmly within Christian hands, seeing its Christian population reach a stable majority, becoming one of the foremost powers of the Mediterranean, whose presence on the Levantine coast had allowed it to export various goods, resources, and riches from the east to the west, particularly to their allied merchant states of Genoa and Venice, who in turn radiated this wealth out to the rest of Italy and Europe, expediting and amplifying the Renaissance. The French, having fully consolidated their realm including the lands of Normandy by the end of the Hundred Years' War, would attempt to further exert their influence over the Outremer given its Frankish and Norman roots. However, much as had been the case with Norman England, Jerusalem would have come to develop an identity and interest all its own, feeling particularly removed from France given its great geographic disconnect and long-standing independence. Jerusalem, the Holy Land, the Outremer, was as independent a state as any other, and though its people carried a mixture of Frankish and Norman blood among others, though it shared the domain of the East Roman Empire, and though it stood for the Church of the Christian West, its identity was something uniquely distinct and new. A powerful, pious, warrior society and bulwark against Eastern threats, a new heart of the Christian faith, a new center of Western commerce, and almost certainly a power destined to shape the centuries to come. Already, Europe would find itself significantly enriched by the state's existence, so much so that journeys across the Atlantic may be postponed for a time, though not forever. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.